the summer of 1854, beneath the burning sun of Mississippi, laughter echoed across the veranda of the Caldwell plantation. It was not joyful laughter. It was cruel. James Caldwell was known for many things: wealth, arrogance, and a hunger for entertainment that often crossed into humiliation. That evening, surrounded by neighboring landowners and bourbon glasses sweating in the heat, he made a wager that would stain his name far beyond the cotton fields. The target of their amusement stood inside the kitchen. Her name was Ruth. She was the plantation's cook, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, and quiet. The men mocked her size openly. They joked that she ate more than the workers. They laughed that no man would ever look at her twice. James smirked. "I'll marry her," he said. The porch fell silent. It began as a joke, a drunken boast. But pride is dangerous in men who believe they own everything. "If I marry the cook," James continued, "I prove that a master can turn even mockery into obedience." Money changed hands. The bet was sealed. Within a week, papers were drawn up. No one questioned the legality. In Mississippi, ownership blurred the lines of morality. The ceremony was private, witnessed only by two men who had laughed the loudest. Ruth stood in a plain white dress that did not fit properly. She did not cry. She did not speak. James expected embarrassment. He expected submission. What he did not expect was the look in her eyes. It was not fear. It was calculation. The South would later remember this marriage as scandal. But in that moment, no one understood what had truly begun, because James Caldwell believed he had made a joke. What he had actually done was give Ruth access to his house, to his name, and to his secrets. And secrets in the wrong hands can burn hotter than any Mississippi summer. The laughter did not stop after the wedding. For weeks, neighboring plantation owners rode out to Caldwell Estate just to witness the spectacle. They expected humiliation. They expected chaos. They expected James Caldwell to grow bored and cast Ruth aside like an old coat. But something strange began to happen. Ruth did not behave like a woman broken by mockery. She moved through the main house quietly, observing everything. She learned the rhythm of the estate. Who handled the accounts? Which overseer drank too much? Which fields produced less than reported? She listened when men assumed she was too foolish to understand their conversations. James barely noticed at first. To him, the marriage was still a trophy, proof of his dominance. At dinners, he would gesture toward Ruth and say, "Even she answers to me." But Ruth did not answer. She adapted. Within months, the kitchen ran with precision unlike before. Waste was reduced. Supplies lasted longer. Workers began receiving measured portions instead of scraps. Even the house servants noticed fewer sudden punishments. And that was when whispers began. "How does she know so much?" one overseer muttered. Because Ruth had always known. Before she became the plantation's cook, she had been raised on another estate, one that had collapsed under debt. She had watched her former master drink away fortunes while ignoring stolen shipments and falsified ledgers. She had learned something valuable. Men who believe they are untouchable rarely check their own foundations. One evening, while James entertained guests on the veranda again, Ruth entered his private study, not out of rebellion, but invitation. Marriage gave her that right. On his desk lay financial documents, trade agreements, cotton contracts, and loans hidden from neighboring estates. James was drowning in debt. The lavish lifestyle, the gambling, the endless need to impress. It was all built on borrowed money. And the men who had laughed at the bet, they were investors. Ruth closed the ledger carefully. The marriage was never about love. But it had become something else. Leverage, because James Caldwell had made one fatal mistake. He had brought intelligence into his house and assumed it came without ambition. James Caldwell did not notice the shift at first. Why would he? The cotton shipments still left on schedule. The guests still toasted his name. The music still played on warm evenings beneath lantern light. From the outside, the Caldwell plantation looked untouched. But inside the house, control had begun to change hands. Ruth started small. She reorganized storage records. She corrected inventory counts. When shipments arrived short, she quietly documented it. When overseers exaggerated yields, she adjusted the numbers before they reached James's desk. And then she waited. The first crack appeared in early autumn. One of James's investors arrived unexpectedly, demanding repayment on a private loan James had assumed could be delayed. The man brought papers, signed papers, detailing terms James had carelessly agreed to while drunk months earlier. James laughed it off, until the investor mentioned foreclosure. That word drained the color from his face. That night, James stormed into his study, flipping through ledgers in frustration. Figures did not add up. Cotton profits were lower than expected. Expenses were higher. "Who's been in here?" he barked. Ruth stood in the doorway. "You asked me to manage the household accounts," she said calmly. "I corrected what was miscalculated." James glared. "You corrected my books?" "They were already wrong," she replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. James had married her for amusement. He had expected obedience, not oversight. But the truth was unavoidable. Ruth understood the estate better than he did. Days later, she requested permission, formally, to oversee negotiations with suppliers. James nearly refused out of pride. "But debt does not respect pride," he agreed. And that decision would echo across Mississippi, because when Ruth met with the cotton broker in town, she did not plead. She renegotiated. She exposed hidden transport fees that had quietly siphoned Caldwell profits for years. She referenced contract clauses the broker assumed no one on the plantation had read. Certainly not the fat cook. Within weeks, expenses dropped. Investors noticed, and so did James's rivals. Whispers changed tone. The bet was no longer amusing. It was strategic. By winter, one fact became undeniable. The plantation was stabilizing. Not because of James Caldwell, but because of the woman he had married as a joke. And in the South of 1854, that realization was far more dangerous than debt. By winter, the laughter had turned into silence. Men who once mocked James Caldwell now watched him carefully. The Caldwell plantation, which had been rumored to collapse under debt, was suddenly thriving again. Shipments were steady. Creditors were quiet. Even the workers whispered that punishments had decreased and rations had improved. But prosperity attracts suspicion. One evening, two of James's former investors arrived unannounced. They did not come with bourbon or jokes this time. They came with questions. "How?" one of them asked, swirling his glass slowly. "Did you manage to correct your accounts so quickly?" James hesitated, because he did not know. Ruth entered the room calmly, carrying tea instead of whiskey. She set the tray down without a tremor in her hands. "The contracts were inefficient," she said plainly. "Transport fees were inflated. Yield reports were misrepresented. Once corrected, the profits aligned." The men stared at her, not laughing, calculating. After they left, James turned on her. "You spoke out of turn." "I spoke accurately," Ruth replied. His pride burned hotter than the fireplace behind him. "You forget your place." Ruth met his eyes without flinching. "No, you changed my place." The words lingered long after she left the room. Over the next months, neighboring plantations began to suffer financial strain. Cotton prices fluctuated. Transport routes shifted. Smaller estates struggled under debt. But Caldwell land remained stable, because Ruth had done something no one expected. She diversified. She arranged smaller crop rotations. She negotiated grain storage agreements. She reduced dependence on a single cotton buyer. Quiet moves, strategic moves. James began receiving letters, not mocking ones. Inquiries. "How did you secure that rate? Who negotiated your contracts? Would your wife be willing to consult?" The South had expected scandal from the bet. Instead, it got transformation. But power rarely shifts without resistance. One night, as Ruth reviewed shipment manifests by candlelight, a stable boy rushed in, breathless. "Ma'am," he whispered urgently, "someone's been in the fields." By morning, 3 acres of cotton were burned. Sabotage. This was no longer a joke. It was a threat. And for the first time, James Caldwell understood something chilling. The greatest risk he had taken was not marrying Ruth. It was underestimating what she would become. The smoke lingered for days. 3 acres of cotton reduced to ash was more than vandalism. It was a warning. Word spread quickly that Caldwell land had been targeted. Some called it jealousy. Others called it revenge. James called it insult. He demanded patrols at night. He ordered the overseers to question workers. Suspicion filled the air like dust after a storm. Ruth said nothing at first. Instead, she studied the burn pattern. The fire had not started randomly. It began near the irrigation ditch. the driest point, and moved with the wind toward the road. Whoever said it understood the land. This wasn't workers, she said quietly one evening. James frowned. Then who? Someone who benefits if we fail. The investors. If Caldwell Estate collapsed, debts would transfer. Land would be divided. Competitors would expand. James felt a slow realization creeping in. The men who once laughed beside him were capable of far worse than mockery. Ruth proposed something bold. "Invite them," she said. "Invite them?" James repeated. "For dinner." Pride told him to refuse. Fear told him to agree. The following Saturday, lanterns lit the veranda once more. The same men who had witnessed the humiliating bet returned, but the mood was different. No laughter, no careless boasting. Ruth served dinner personally. Halfway through the meal, she placed documents on the table. Insurance policies, signed weeks before the fire. James stared at her in shock. "You insured the fields," he whispered. She nodded slightly. "And the transport routes and the storage barns." One of the investors shifted uncomfortably. "Are you suggesting something?" Ruth's voice remained steady. "I am suggesting," she said, "that accidents are expensive, especially when investigations follow." Silence tightened around the table. James finally understood the full extent of her strategy. She had not only stabilized the plantation, she had protected it from sabotage, and possibly trapped those responsible. Days later, rumors spread that state officials were reviewing suspicious land transfers connected to certain investors. The Caldwell estate was no longer vulnerable. It was fortified. That night, James stood alone on the veranda, watching Ruth oversee repairs in the fields. He had married her to prove power. Instead, she had built something stronger than power: influence. And influence, unlike ownership, could not be taken by force. The investigation did not stay quiet for long. Within weeks, 2 of James Caldwell's former investors were formally questioned about suspicious insurance claims filed on neighboring estates. One property had burned under similar circumstances. Another had defaulted on debt just days before a profitable land transfer. Patterns began to emerge. And for the first time, James Caldwell was not the reckless gambler at the table. He was the man who had been warned in advance. State officials visited the plantation under the guise of routine inspection. They reviewed insurance papers, contracts, shipment records. Everything was in order, meticulously in order. One official glanced at Ruth while signing a document. "You keep clean books." "I keep honest ones," she replied. James watched the exchange carefully. Something inside him had shifted, not entirely pride, not entirely humility, something closer to awareness. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the cotton rows, he found Ruth standing near the irrigation ditch where the fire had begun. "You knew," he said quietly. "I suspected," she answered. "You protected my land." Ruth turned slowly. "I protected what I built." The distinction struck him harder than accusation. For months, James had told himself the estate was his by right. But the stability, the growth, the survival, those were hers. News traveled quickly across Mississippi. The Caldwell plantation was now spoken of with a different tone. Not scandal, strategy. And then came the letter. A formal invitation from a regional agricultural board requesting James Caldwell and his wife to attend a gathering of estate owners to discuss new trade standards. James read the final line twice. Particularly interested in Mrs. Caldwell's financial restructuring methods. He lowered the paper slowly. The South had expected humiliation when he married his cook as a bet. Instead, it was now studying her. Ruth did not smile when he handed her the letter. She simply said, "Then we will attend." And as lanterns were lit once more across the veranda, it became clear that the greatest shock to the South was not the marriage itself. It was the realization that the woman they mocked had outplayed them all. The gathering was held in a grand hall in Jackson. Men who had once laughed at the Caldwell bet now stood in pressed coats beneath crystal chandeliers, speaking in careful tones about tariffs, shipments, and expanding trade routes. When James Caldwell entered with Ruth at his side, conversation thinned into uneasy silence. Not because of scandal, because of reputation. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," he said formally, "we've heard of your methods." Ruth did not bow her head. She stepped forward. "For years," she began calmly, "plantations have depended on pride instead of planning. You gamble on cotton prices. You trust brokers without reading contracts. You borrow against land without securing protection. Murmurs rippled across the hall. And then, she continued, when the land burns, you blame the wind. A few men shifted uncomfortably. James watched her speak, not as property, not as a punchline, but as authority. She outlined diversified crop rotation, insurance layering, transparent accounting, and direct negotiation with transport agents. She spoke in numbers, not emotion, in facts, not apology. By the end of the evening, 3 estate owners requested private consultations. 2 weeks later, 5 more. The South had not been shocked by scandal. It was shocked by competence. Back at Caldwell Plantation, something else had changed. Workers noticed contracts being rewritten. Families were no longer separated to cover debts. Food portions increased when harvests improved. Punishments became rare. Ruth had insisted on one principle. If this land survives because of intelligence, then it cannot operate on cruelty. James resisted at first, but prosperity silenced resistance. Years passed. The bet that once echoed in drunken laughter faded into history. In its place stood a different story, whispered across counties, of the plantation owner who married his cook for sport, and discovered he had married the sharpest mind in Mississippi. On their 10th anniversary, James stood beside Ruth on the veranda where it had all begun. I thought I was proving power, he admitted quietly. Ruth looked over the thriving fields, the repaired barns, the orderly accounts. You were, she said. He frowned slightly. Just not yours. The South had expected disgrace. Instead, it witnessed transformation. And the greatest shock of all, the joke had never been the marriage. It had been the men who believed she was less than them. By 1860, the Caldwell Plantation was no longer whispered about in mockery. It was studied. What began as a drunken wager had become a quiet revolution in Mississippi's agricultural circles. Estate owners who once dismissed Ruth as a spectacle now sent letters requesting guidance. Her accounting methods were copied. Her contract structures were imitated. But admiration never erased prejudice. At public gatherings, some men still avoided speaking to her directly. They addressed James instead, as if authority could not possibly sit in her hands. James no longer corrected them, because he did not need to. The result spoke louder than pride. Then the nation began to tremble. Political tensions rose across the South. Trade routes grew unstable. Rumors of war drifted through towns and along river ports. Plantations that relied solely on cotton exports felt the first tremors of uncertainty. But Caldwell land endured. Ruth had prepared for instability long before anyone else believed it possible. Grain storage had been expanded. Debt had been minimized. Risk had been divided instead of concentrated. When markets tightened, smaller estates began collapsing under pressure. Once again, eyes turned toward Caldwell. One evening, as storm clouds gathered in the distance, James found Ruth reviewing ledgers by lamplight. You knew this was coming, he said quietly. I knew comfort never lasts, she replied. He studied her for a long moment. I married you for a bet. She did not look up, and I accepted for survival. Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not bitter. Honest. Years earlier, she had entered this house in a dress that did not fit, surrounded by laughter meant to humiliate her. Now she stood at the center of a system that functioned because of her mind. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. James stepped onto the veranda and looked over the land that had once symbolized control. It no longer belonged to arrogance. It belonged to discipline, to strategy, to foresight. Behind him, Ruth joined him at the railing. The wind lifted slightly, carrying the scent of rain. The South expected scandal, James said. Ruth's gaze remained steady on the horizon. What it received, she answered, was consequence. The storm finally broke. Heavy rain sweeping across cotton rows that would survive because someone had planned beyond pride. The bet that was meant to entertain had reshaped an empire. And the greatest shock of 1854 was not that a plantation owner married his cook. It was that the woman they mocked had become the architect of their future.